Hello, this is David Bernstein, founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and I'm delighted to be here today with my good friend Jeffrey Salkin, Rabbi Jeffrey Salkin. Um, Rabbi Salkin is an author of a new book, a very important book. I have it right here. It's called Tikkun Ha'am, Israel and the Crisis of Liberal Judaism, Repairing Our People. Rabbi Salkin is a noted author and American Jewish thought leader, and most recently the co-founder of Wisdom Without Walls, an online salon for Jewish ideas, wisdomwithoutwalls.org, which engages major thinkers and Jews in conversations about Judaism post-October 7th, wisdomwithoutwalls.org. Rabbi, I'm really pleased to have you on.
David, it's a pleasure to be with you.
So you've just written this book. It couldn't be more timely. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was coming out around the time of October 7th or just thereafter. And while all of what you wrote was on point, you did a new introduction to the book based on October 7th and what that would imply. Is that correct?
Basically, you're absolutely right, David. On October 7th, I realized that the introduction that I had written for the book was inadequate. On October 8th, I called the publisher, Wicked Sun Press, and I said that old cliche, stop the presses. And I sat down and wrote a new introduction, which crafted what I believe would be the contours, the shape of a new emerging American Judaism post-October 7th. The rest of the book is as is. It's really an extended meditation on what it would take for us to rebuild liberal Judaism in America.
Yeah, so let's go there. Maybe I'll frame it with Brett Stevens' recent piece, which is that who is the October 8th Jew? I'm wondering, this is what your book is. What is the October 8th Jew? What is the October 8th Jewish community? What is the October 8th synagogue? What is the October 8th Jewish organization?
Okay, here's what I think. The October 8th Jew has realized that he or she is far more connected to the Jewish people than he or she had imagined previously. Mm-hmm. The October 8th Jew also has become increasingly suspicious, if not outright depressed, at the abandonment of the Jewish community by our so-called progressive allies on the extreme left. The October 8th Jew also is seeking conversation and inspiration. That's why we started wisdomwithoutwalls.org to engage people in that. The October 8th Jew also has become increasingly suspicious about the values that are found in higher education. And the October 8th Jew is also very much concerned about the growth of anti-Semitism in this country, which we had always believed was mostly located on the right, but now is also coming from the left. We comforted ourselves by saying that the anti-Semitism from the right was violent and the anti-Semitism from the left was verbal. And I have said there's a 100% probability that verbal anti-Semitism will metastasize into being violent anti-Semitism, only because I'm a student of Jewish history, and that's the way it's always been. Now, I'll say one other thing about the October 8th Jew. Mm-hmm. Based on my understanding of what it was like to be a Jew after the Six-Day War, 1967, American Jewish institutions and synagogues have an immense responsibility and, by the way, a sacred opportunity to shape this conversation and to bring Jews back into the Jewish community and to infuse the Jewish community with new meaning if they manage it correctly.
Yeah. So both of us are out there, right? We're both talking to groups in the Jewish community. I've since October 7th, I can't tell you how many talks I've given. And I'm wondering if your observations are in line with my own. Here's what I've seen so far. I go around and I raise these issues as much as the way you do, framed similarly, and I'm almost stunned, and I shouldn't be anymore. How many rank and file American Jews have actually made the conceptual leap in their own mind? That I've talked to a firebrand progressive law partner who said, I don't know where I fit in to the world anymore. I hear a lot of that. Or a reform rabbi who is very much part of the progressive left, who probably wouldn't have had me speak before October 7th, and now, enthusiastically brought me in to talk and to have this conversation that she herself really wanted to have. So I have that. But what I'm not seeing so much of, and this is really where I want to get your insights, is that the institutionalized Jewish community has actually shifted much because of this. Is that what is your feeling so far?
David, I'm afraid, I hate to say this, I'm afraid that you're spot on. Individual Jews have reported to me, including many colleagues, a profound disappointment and even a borderline depression about what has happened with us politically. I have experienced many of my friends and colleagues who were on the far left moving towards what you and I would call and would celebrate as classic liberalism or the center. Some people even flirting with a kind of neoconservatism. That's what I'm seeing in the trenches. I'm not yet seeing that on the part of Jewish organizations, and I wish that they would, as it were, get with the program. At the very least, there have to be sacred and I think in some ways intimate conversations with our partners and allies, and we have to say to them, you hurt us. You let us out to dry. You hung us. You abandoned us. Any self-respecting group would do that. We have to be able to say to women's groups that you blithely ignored or downplayed, and in some cases even rationalized, the gynocide, the violence against women, against Jewish women that happened. And we have to be able to say on the college campuses, in a culture where people are obsessed with microaggressions, you allow microaggressions against only one people. Oh, by the way, macroaggressions against only one people. And that happens to be the Jewish people. Houston, we've got a problem.
Yeah.
We do have a problem.
Yeah. So going back to Jewish organizations for a second and trying to understand where the inertia is coming from. I don't know. I mean, these are theories that that one thing is that when you actually contemplate the level of shift that would be required, Jewish organizations that have been positioned with the left for many, many years are having a hard time, because they know if they start sounding differently, talking like many of the people that are in their own pews, that they're going to alienate themselves with many of their traditional progressive allies, and they're not yet ready, or they're not psychologically ready or politically ready to make that change. What is your take on that? Why?
Look, psychologically, David, we have to say, yes, it's hard to make that change. Institutionally, these large institutions, these legacy organizations, and I'm familiar with a few of them, are like ocean liners, and they're very hard to turn. And third, I also think there is a kind of institutional inertia in which people have bought into a particular political narrative. It's very hard for institutions to rethink that. What you and I have experienced is the way it normally is, David. Individuals can rethink themselves, but institutions have leadership. They've got boards. The boards have a history. There's a budget. And I think it's very difficult for people to make that change. And I'll say something.
Staffs too. They have staff people who work for them as well.
Well, that's also true, but there's something else. Sometimes there's a denial of what history has taught us. And we're living in an age that is not really profoundly interested in history. You and I know something because you and I have talked about this, and we are students of Jewish history. We know that there is a 100% betrayal rate, both from extreme nationalist elements, right-wing elements, and extreme left-wing communist elements against the Jewish people. 100% of the time, we got sold out. And that is potentially what is happening now as American Jews politically find themselves really buttressed between the left and the right, especially as we come into an election year. It's a frightening time.
Are you finding it easier to raise these questions within established institutions, even if they haven't yet made the shift themselves? Are you able to talk to the synagogue that might have been reluctant to hear this message before October 7th? Are you able to speak to mainstream Jewish organizations that were reluctant to hear them? Or is the jury still out on that?
It's hard to know how easy or difficult that will be. When I go to individual synagogues and speak, and I'm happy to say my calendar is full, I see a lot of people nodding in the pews, and many of the rabbis take me aside and they say, you're absolutely right. I also would say this. I am part of an effort called Recharging Reform. We had a conference last year at Stephen Wise Synagogue in New York. We're going to be doing it again. But in fact, this is a very important piece of the puzzle. We understand that there has been a Control-Alt-Delete on American Judaism on October 8th, and we are trying to get our minds around it. We are to be forgiven, by the way, if only several months into this trauma, we haven't yet figured it out. But what I have outlined in the book are already my takeaways. I said to someone recently, did you ever think that October 7th would provoke a full-blown cultural war in America?
Yeah, that's an incredible. In other words, the Jews are central to the culture war debate somehow. And I can tell you right afterwards, as somebody who follows sort of the liberalism discourse on social media and the like, I could tell you that many of the people that have been trying to fight the good fight on restoring classical liberal values in our institutions immediately saw the opportunity that came with angering the American Jewish community, and said, well, maybe this will finally be a turning point in the discussion about universities. If we can get the American Jews and many of the donors behind it and so forth, maybe that will provoke a shift. Is that what's happening?
Okay, this is very, very complicated. The driving force behind those conversations, a certain congresswoman, is not our friend.
Mm-hmm.
She's not someone we would hang out with. Mm-hmm. She actually has espoused certain ideas that you and I might call anti-Semitic. And yet, like a broken clock, she was right once or twice a day. She attacked these universities because she has her own agenda, but she used, this is classic, she used the Jewish flag in doing so. Now, here would be the real tragedy. The real tragedy would be if American Jews took these particular problems with what is happening in the American university system and these philosophical issues with post-colonialism and relativism and Marxist theory and all that, and they decided to sign on to the anti-intellectual elements in American society. That's an absolute failure for American Jews. Frankly, while I see some leaders and big givers making those sounds, someone asked me the other day, Jeff, do you really think that American Jews are going to stop sending their kids to Harvard and Yale? And my answer was no. They'll just make sure that their kids understand the situation much better than they would have.
Yeah. It was interesting. I mean, obviously, that was a pivotal moment when Congresswoman Stefanik posed those questions. I don't have to agree with her on everything to be sort of grateful for her framing in some ways. It was highly effective. It did spark a conversation that needed to be sparked, in my view, whether it was from out of good faith or not, right? I think that conversation must be had. And it might be an irony that the American Jewish community is central to this in a way that I don't think any of us had imagined. That we have the potential to push through a new paradigm. Somehow we ignited something that wasn't on fire before, but we were successful in doing so. So anyway, I think it's a fascinating time to and trying to get my head around how the American Jewish community fits into this is really challenging.
Well, you're saying something that's making me think. Not since Europe in the 1930s has a Jewish community and has Jewish civilization been as pivotal and as central in a cultural conversation as it has been over the last several months. Isn't that amazing? And for those of us who fight the grandiosity narrative, that the Jews are at the center of everything because that could be used against us.
Sure.
Isn't it amazing how this became the story of the Jews?
It's amazing. And look, we do aspire to play a role in the development of civilization, and perhaps restoring liberal values should be a legacy of the Jewish people. And I've always hoped so. I worried it wasn't going to be the case, but now I'm starting to see the potential there. That key segments of the American Jewish community are going to be activated in this struggle ahead.
David, we're facing a civilizational failure here. I just recently heard that more than 60% of young people between the ages of 18 and 24 take the side of Hamas against
Yes.
Israel. They think that the violence of Hamas was justified. And are you ready for this? More than 60% of them believe that the Jews are an oppressor class.
Yes.
This is a recipe for violent disaster.
Yeah.
You know, I want to say this. You've been to Europe, you've vacationed in Europe. I want to go to Europe too. I like Europe. I just don't want to go back to Europe in the 1930s.
Right. Right. And I feel like maybe that's what we're living. It was funny. I had a conversation with two South African Jews recently and talking about the South African Jewish condition. And I said, well, is the South African Jewish community going to survive? And the woman said to me, well, where do you think we're going to go? Israel, is that better? Or United States, is that better? I mean, I think it is better in both of those places in some ways, but it just shows you that the Jewish condition is not so secure in any of these places anymore. And maybe that's where we're going back to in a way. At the same time, you know, we're not the same community as we were in the 1930s. And I do feel like we have agency. I do feel like we have a voice. And I do feel like we can help make a difference and change the course of history.
You're absolutely right. When people say it's just like the Holocaust, it's just like the 1930s, I say, wait, just slow down. Slow down. Mm-hmm. All those Jewish organizations that we wish were more effective, they exist. They did not exist with the strength, power, and influence as they do now back in the 1930s. We certainly have agency. And we have power, we have influence, and we have cultural capital. We have cultural capital in this country that, by the way, is untapped and unused. One of my pet peeves is how we really punch below our weight when it comes to our major American Jewish cultural figures, even popular entertainers who are not doing enough yet. They're making sounds. They're making sounds, but if they ever really harness the power that we saw in 1943, when Jews and Gentile performers took a show on the road, We Shall Never Die, okay, raising consciousness about what was happening in Europe, if we ever did that, it would be immense.
Yeah. So we've talked about so far about the implications of this. What do you think this can do for Jewish identity and Jewish peoplehood?
I think it's going to strengthen it. I think many American Jews, as I said earlier, are absolutely shocked at how connected they are. A few anecdote. Rabbis have said, and I've written about this in my column, Martini Judaism, for those who want to be shaken and stirred on religionnews.com. Mm-hmm. I have said that many rabbis have reported a sudden uptick in the number of people who want to convert to Judaism and join the Jewish people. I have heard anecdotally, again, anecdote, the number of people who are checking out 23andMe, who are all of a sudden discovering that while they thought they were totally Hispanic, there's a Sephardic Jew somewhere there in the bloodline. I am hearing, again, anecdotally, about more young people who are interested in taking gap years in Israel. Now, has this filtered down into the American synagogue? That's a whole other conversation about how synagogues are and how the liberal movements are functioning. But again, in the micro, I think there's a great deal of potential here.
Yeah, let's go there for a second about synagogues. Carol Markowitz, she's a writer, recently wrote a piece about synagogue life and how disconnected it's becoming. I even heard Yehuda Kurtzer from Hartman say that the crop of liberal rabbis coming out of the liberal rabbinical schools is very out of sync with where most American Jews are on Israel and Zionism and probably other ideological factors. How do we, do you agree with that, A? And B, if so, how do we deal with that?
Sadly, I have to agree with that. Again, anecdotals, colleagues have said to me, who have been in the midst of interviewing younger colleagues to take positions as assistant or associate rabbis, they're bemoaning the fact that many of the students that they're interviewing are non-Zionist or anti-Zionist. And we should not be surprised, again, if we link what we now know to be true in terms of national attitudes that we would find, let's say, in the Pew study, with the people who would be applying to rabbinical school and the people who are now graduating from rabbinical school. And I have heard from congregational leaders that, yes, they are finding that the rabbis that they are interviewing are out of step with where they are in terms of Israel. Now, that's not to say that the congregational leaders are right wing on Israel. But
Right.
what they are feeling is that some of the rabbis that they are encountering are very, very left. And I keep hearing this, and I don't know what to do about this. It's beyond me at this particular point. But I do think it is a major challenge because a younger generation is arising who knew not Joseph, who knew not what the previous generations had come to understand. Now, let me say again positively, perhaps this will lead to a reassessment of Zionism. Perhaps it will lead to a different kind of Zionism. Perhaps a critical Zionism is not the worst thing in the world that we should be looking at. But I will say this, being emotional, while we still have hostages in tunnels, I'm not interested in this conversation, how we have to redo our allegiance to Israel. I'll wait for another time for that. We're still in an emergent situation. We still have people whose dead potentially lie before them.
Yeah. It also seems to me it's very easy to look at like the rabbis coming out of these liberal movements and say, okay, there's a problem with young people. And I think writ large, there is a problem with young people. And I think the Harvard-Harris poll that you pointed to earlier is a sign of that. But the truth is, I think a lot of American Jews are still quite moderate in nature. There was a letter, one of these sign-on letters that was done by some graduates of the Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School, where my oldest son graduated from, and it was very, very critical of Israel, and it basically called Israel settler colonial state, and I think a lot of people immediately shried gavalt about that. Oh my God, look what's happening. But right afterwards, there were two other letters that were written, signed by hundreds more students than signed that original letter. So it seems to me that, every time you expand the scope of the referendum, you realize that these attitudes are less prevalent than they might seem to be, because the people who espouse them are so loud and so bullying sometimes in their tactics that they seem to be more prominent than they actually are. Is that your experience?
I think that is true. And there's something else as well that I experienced after October 7th. There's a new nihilism that is taking place in America. It's almost an utter trashing of liberal values. It's a new French Revolution. It's so disheartening. And the war against truth that we thought was taking place only on the right, it turns out to be taking place on the left as well. The whole notion of narratives, counter narratives, new narratives. It occurred to me recently that Israel is the only country whose very origin is still up for plebiscite, is still up for discussion. Yeah. We're still rehashing this, and we're chewing this over. Lastly, I'll say something else about Charles E. Smith and other community day schools and to why this is happening. Part of it, I think, is rooted in a kind of disappointment. The whole notion of, you never told us the truth, young people who are being disillusioned. And perhaps this will lead to a more nuanced conversation about what the reality of Israel really is. I think that for many years, despite reality, we're still selling the Exodus version, the Paul Newman version of Israel, and it was a fairy tale. We sold the idea of Israel as Jewish theme park. I think in some ways, Taglit Birthright, which I greatly admire, kind of feeds into that. We had to export kids to a foreign place in order to give them a taste of living Judaism. So you pile up all these experiences that we've manufactured over the years, and the ideological chickens came home to roost. Takeaway would be, going forward, we have to be more nuanced and we have to be more honest.
Yeah, I think that's a factor. And I've been talking about that for years when I worked for another organization called the David Project, which did Israel education and advocacy training program. And I felt like we hadn't been educating our kids in an open way. And they get to campus and hear things for the first time and say, you lied to me. But in my view, the much larger phenomena is an ideological one, externally imposed. It's, they're being conditioned in this sort of oppressed oppressor binary. It's a very simplistic way of looking at the world. And they're acceptance into that their own coalitions and their own community of the good is predicated on them buying into this ideology, so they want to be in line with it. So there's a segment of the American Jewish community, young people, who are then applying that as the moral lens, maybe in part because they feel like the Jewish community disappointed it, but I think, in my view, in larger part because they've been politically indoctrinated with a completely different worldview.
I think that's true. I think in some ways it goes back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the wars of the sons of light versus the sons of darkness. And everyone imagines that everyone on their side are the sons of light and everyone else is the sons of darkness, this kind of dualistic view. But more than that, I think one of the things that we need to be able to teach is that the Jews and the Jewish culture does not neatly fit into these intellectual paradigms that work in other settings but do not work for us. That is an educational opportunity. It doesn't quite work that way. This whole idea of settler colonialism and everything. These are words. These are words, and I will not taint this broadcast by telling you what I think about these words. This is intellectual tripe. And we have to be able to stand up to that. And we have to be able to say, no, this is wrong. Excuse me, there is an internationally accepted legal definition of genocide. Genocide is not simply what you think genocide is.
Right. Yeah. It may be another failure. I'd like to get your thoughts on this, is the fact that liberal Jewish parents, people like us, instead of teaching our kids how to think, we taught them what to think about the world. So it may be too simplistically, support reproductive rights, support church-state separation, support this, support that. We gave them a platform of issues rather than a process by which to look through the world to debate issues. I wonder if we lost the plot ourselves and did a bad job of raising our kids.
On October 7th and October 8th, there were any number of Jewish parents who were getting frantic texts from their kids on college campuses. I'm being called a neo-apartheid colonialist genocidal maniac.
Yeah.
And then the parents start texting the rabbis, what do I tell my kids? And the rabbis are too polite to tell the truth, which is, and who told you to pull your kid out of any Jewish involvement as soon as he or she hit puberty? Right. The level of post-bar bat mitzvah engagement in this country among liberal Jews is still at a scandalous level. One of the things that I am hoping for is that this will push for a reinvigoration of such programs, because what's happened is that parents sent their kids out into the world without vaccinations. You wouldn't dream of not vaccinating your child or yourself against COVID-19, but we failed to vaccinate our kids. Not that there is inoculation here. We forgot to, failed to, and in some cases chose not to give them a Jewish intellectual background, not so that they could parrot the answers, but so that they could learn to think as Jews.
Yeah. In terms of the way that people might come to see themselves, do you think this is going to reinforce the religious aspect of Jewish identity or the ethnic nationalist aspect of Jewish identity, or both? Do you see it trending one way or the other?
Actually, what I see happening, David, is something even more interesting, which is that I don't see that there's any clear membrane now that's going to separate the two. I'm looking at a Jewish community and a Jewish identity in America, which is much messier than it used to be. Whether people engage ethnically or culturally or religiously, and how they choose to engage religiously, to use the cliche, it's all good. It's all going to go into the mix. If I were to predict something, I would say that this will initially fuel the ethnic identity, peoplehood identity of American Jews. But if we're lucky, it will also filter down into a religious identity, because I'm not really sure we can build much of a distinction between the two. The two are dependent upon each other.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a question that I often get early on in a Q&A, but I'm putting it toward the end because I don't think it belongs early on. Maybe you'll have a different view. We hear a lot about the young Jews who are joining Jewish Voices for Peace, or if not now, these are the kids in the Ceasefire Now rallies and so forth. Sometimes these are children of very prominent American Jews. Rabbis have kids in the sort of post-Zionist, anti-Zionist camp. How do you think that the mainstream Jewish community should regard them? What should be our posture toward them?
It's interesting. Since you and I are both published by Wicked Sun Press, it's tempting to treat
Yes.
them as the wicked children in the
Yeah.
Pasuk Haggadah.
Yeah.
No, actually, I want to treat them actually as the child who is she'eno yodeo lishol, who doesn't even know how to ask the right questions. And what is the solution for them? At patachlo, you open up the conversation for them. I am not interested in pushing an entire generation of kids to the curb, because that's the generation of my kids.
Yeah.
That being said, I think we have to tell the truth. And I think there is a lot of education that did not happen here. I will also be the first to say that some of this is rebellion, the way that you and I rebelled against our parents. Some of this is an ideological way of saying, okay, boomer. I get it. I get it. But I do not want an American Jewish community run by Jewish Voice for Peace. I want an American Jewish community that finds room for everyone in this conversation, but also not only has permeable membranes, but also has walls. Or let's put it this way. We are not a castle surrounded by a moat. We have walls, but we also have drawbridges. We have to put the drawbridge down. But we can't be willing to sacrifice an essential part of our narrative, which is Eretz Yisrael and Medina Yisrael. That's immoral surgery, and no people should be asked to endure it.
There's this approach that developed in the mainstream Jewish community to young Jews and to Jews maybe writ large. It's sort of, I would call it like a segmented marketing approach. And it said, look, let's look at how young Jews express themselves more generally, and let's find a Judaism that speaks to their values so that we can remain relevant in their lives. So some Jewish organizations bend over backward to sort of articulate a Tikkun Ha'am Judaism. Not that there's anything wrong with that per se, but they emphasize it to the exclusion of many other things. There could be Jews in yoga. There could be, whatever. They're looking for a way in. And I wonder what that does collectively. I remember a top marketing guru says that marketing fails when you customize every sale. And I wonder if we're trying to customize every sale rather than actually position our brand. What is your view on that?
It's really interesting. The metaphor I like to use, I don't know who suggested it. I think a rabbi a number of years ago wrote an essay about this, a parable about a guy who wants to start a French restaurant. And he starts a French restaurant and he's serving an amazing food. And then people start saying, but we don't want the menu in French. We don't really read French. And we shouldn't have to ask the waiters to translate the menu from the French. So could you put the English translation in there? He said, okay. And then they came to him and they said, the French food, it's not bad, but you really need more stuff for kids here if you want to make it kid friendly. Can we have hot dogs and can we have pizza? He said, okay. And then they said, we really don't like the soft French music that you're playing. It might bring more people in if you played disco. And at a certain point he said, what happened to my restaurant? And I think at a certain point, we should be programmatically accommodating and we should have a big tent. And I think our Judaism will, I'm going to use this term again, continue to be messy. But I'm not interested in a Judaism that wants to be all things to all people. Well, one of the things that I write about in Tikkun Ha'am, Repairing Our People, Israel and the Crisis of Liberal Judaism, is that liberal Judaism has not stood up to the dominant cultural forces of American society. We have not spoken truth to culture. Now, what do I mean by this? Number one, consumerism. We have turned Judaism into a consumer product. Number two, hyper-individualism. We're all, in the words of Robert Putnam, we're bowling alone. Number three, I think that we have created a culture that depends on therapy, on making me feel good. Number four, a culture that worships technology. Beyond that, I think that what we have forgotten and what people really long for is a Judaism that is a counterculture, a Judaism that says that there are certain things about the world that are not good. For me, for example, one of the great things about Shabbat that I envy in my Orthodox friends is that they don't spend money on Shabbat. Not only because handling money is against halakha, against Jewish law. But if I go deeper, I say to myself, there's got to be a day where I am not part of consumer culture. There has to be a day where I judge myself not by what I can buy, not by what I own, not by by what I have, but by who I am and the relationships that I'm in. That's a very powerful thing. And many young people really would want to hear that.
Right. Some won't, but that's okay. And I think that's the challenge. Like we have to be okay with some not wanting to go along with what we have to offer. But if we alter what we have to offer so much, then it doesn't resemble what it used to be, what it is, what's authentic, what's compelling about it. And I feel like we've lost the plot on that. I think you just put it very, very succinctly and thoughtfully. And I'm wondering if the institutions are going to start to catch on to that. If it does, and it really goes back to the parable of the Haggadah and the four sons in a way. Like, okay, so I agree with you. Let's label some of these JVP kids, the kids who doesn't know how to ask the right questions. But maybe somewhere along the line, there is a wicked son that we have to contend with. I'm not talking about, that doesn't mean disown your own children. It means that at some point we have to say to ourselves, look, I get it. You're an individual. It's okay that you have your opinions. I can't change it. It's a free country, but that's not, I'm not necessarily going to bring you into the Jewish tent.
Okay. So here, David, thank you for pushing me. What's the sin of the wicked son in the Haggadah? Ma avodah hazot lachem. What does this service mean to you?
Yeah.
To you and not to himself. To you and not to herself. Here's what's happened. Liberal Jewish educational institutions have not yet succeeded in teaching the notion of Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, as a family. We have not yet succeeded in saying what you and I know, which is that those hostages are our cousins and our kids. This needs to be a feral, primitive idea that burns within us, that we are a tribe. This is also what I write about in the book. We are a tribe. That's not the same as being tribalistic, but we're a tribe. And if we can celebrate the tribalism of Native Americans, American Indians, then we should be able to celebrate our own tribe, our own myth, our own story, our own collection of song, poetry, etc. It's okay for us to believe that. And forgive me, in a world that is increasingly multicultural and paradoxically, in a parallel sense, being cut into ever thinner layers, self-respect demands that we see ourselves as being part of a tribe. This means this: Ahavat Yisrael, the feral, basic love of the Jewish people, which, by the way, Gershom Scholem accused Hannah Arendt of lacking. We need to teach that. I love every Jew. I don't like every Jew. I love every Jew. This is a mitzvah for me. And we don't often do that. I think we're embarrassed by it.
Yeah. Well, Rabbi Salkin, I am so grateful that you have written this book at the time that you wrote it. I think it's absolutely imperative that these conversations start to seep into the popular Jewish imagination, that they take place in our synagogues and our JCCs and our federations and our Jewish advocacy organizations. And I'm so glad that you gave us a framework for having it. I'm very much looking forward to sharing it with others and to being in ongoing conversation with you.
Thank you. And let me just say, Wisdom Without Walls was founded because we sense that there's a hunger on the part of American Jews to engage in conversation about what it means to be Jewish post-October 7th. And that's what we do. We have had phenomenal success thus far, bringing in thought leaders who are engaging Jews in these very sensitive conversations.
That sounds wonderful. Can't wait to be part of it.
Thank you. Love to have you.
All right. See you later. Take care, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.